Syaoran Li believed he was destined to be one of the greatest magicians who ever lived. A distant Hong Kong descendant from the legendary mage Clow Reed, Syaoran was exposed to the world of magic at an early age. One could only imagine the sheer extent to which this left an impression on the young boy. Especially since his mother was involved in a clan of powerful sorcerers, Syaoran learned that he was blessed with a bloodline, a knack for magic, and people who could teach him that very magic. These three things easily separated him from other children, or even potential magicians, in the world. After a revelation like this, everything that he did from his youth to the present was spent bettering both his body and his mind. He would strive to do nothing less than fulfill what he felt was rightfully his, particularly if a birthright was involved. He would master the Clow and become their next keeper. But in that bid to become the best that he could be, he found himself becoming an island unto himself. Whether he intended to or not, the training gave Syaoran a no-nonsense attitude and a lonely, hard edge, one that would come across as brusque if not outright uninviting to whomever would be unfortunate enough to meet or interact with him. It was only through his closest personal servants like his guardian Wei or his cousin Meiling that a softer aspect of himself would appear. His personality could be said to be the polar opposite of Kinomoto Sakura. Whereas Sakura was a person who radiated sunshine and positivity in most things that she did, including sports and spending time with her second cousin Tomoyo, Syaoran was reserved and preferred to spend his time mastering his magic alone. Sakura was slow to anger, whereas for Syaoran, he showed it more often. However, he showed it less for the purposes of being a mean-spirited person on purpose, and more as a means of channeling his own inner conviction and fuel for his own hubris. His frustration became a weapon and inspiration to become even better. It wasn't simply that they were different personality-wise, but everything about Sakura seemed to be antithetical to what Syaoran spent so much of his youth doing and believing in. Here was a girl who did not proactively practice her magic, spent most of her time engaging in frivolities, and could barely fight any of the Clow cards that were wreaking havoc in Tomoeda. And yet, despite all of her incompetence, she was the one who had unlocked the magic of the Clow cards and was imbued with the power to seal them away again? What could she possibly have that I don't have? Why would the Clow cards, and especially Keroberos as Beast of the Seal, desire her to be their new master? Such a thought is something that cannot be understated. The reality that Syaoran could have what he believed was rightfully his, denied by this silly girl, could not have been anything less than a most infuriating thought. It therefore would come as no surprise that, when the two would eventually meet, Syaoran's personality would clash with Sakura, and markedly so. After discovering her possession of the Clow cards, Syaoran, in a moment of his frustration getting the better of him, physically attacked Sakura in order to obtain them by force. Sakura, in her nervous and early state in the series, couldn't put up much of a resistance either physically or argumentatively against him. It was only through the intervention of her older brother Toya that the fight was stopped, and the arrival of Yukito disarmed the conflict further with a seemingly innocent act of wanting to share food with Syaoran. Syaoran, in a strange moment of being caught off guard and unusually nervous, scampered away. This encounter ultimately served two purposes for Syaoran's character. Firstly, it established that if he was indeed going to become the master of the Clow cards, dealing with Sakura directly would never get him what he wanted. She had too many people close to her to give him such a prime opportunity to just up and take them away. If he was to obtain the cards, he would do it by proving his worth to the cards themselves personally in battle. Secondly, it also unveiled that despite his physical capabilities, such that Toya acknowledged his fighting stance as Chinese in origin, Syaoran was still a child and perhaps not as incorrigible as he might first appear. Yukito's presence especially cements this understanding. Syaoran and Yukito's dynamic, which led to an infatuation with him, would factor into the show's overarching theme of love in its many forms being able to exist and somehow enrich the lives of those it touches. But even with this element established, Sakura's own infatuation with Yukito gave Syaoran another reason to consider Sakura someone in his way, which added an additional coldness to the already frosty relationship they had. There was a speck of warmth in there, though. Syaoran's amorous feelings may not have been directed towards Sakura, but it was indeed a case where Syaoran wanted to, on some level, be a warmer and more impressionable person. Even though the story would progress to the point where those feelings would fade, and an explanation tied to Syaoran's magical background would wrap up the thread about his attraction to Yukito, by the time the series was over, that warmth would eventually take hold of Syaoran completely. Yet that coldness didn't melt away immediately. As stated before, from their very first substantial interactions, Syaoran made it clear just how little he thought of Sakura's capabilities as a magician herself. Any indication that they could become amicable, much less actual friends, was off the table. Both as they battled the Clow and would meet at school, he would rebuke and refuse all of her attempts to become friends. For Syaoran, being friends was not an option. Sakura was a rival, an obstacle on his path to the greatness he envisioned. Sakura's relationship with Syaoran would take on an added layer of interpretation with the arrival of Meiling Li. Much like Syaoran himself, Meiling was headstrong and firmly believed in her own capabilities. She was not a magician like he was. She would never be able to actually possess any of the Clow cards for herself. However, she was a physically competent fighter, though she rarely helped Syaoran, and much like his unwavering desire to obtain the Clow, she was unwaveringly attached to Syaoran, such that she unilaterally declared that she would marry him in due time. Her feelings stemmed from a display of genuine kindness on Syaoran's part, in which he rescued her pet bird, which he had spent hours trying to find and return to her. Meiling's story helps illuminate that, while Syaoran's childhood was mostly lonely and spent honing himself, he was indeed not a heartless child. He was perfectly capable of caring for someone or something, and thus his actions signify that, as egocentric as his quest to possess the Clow could be, there was always a small kernel of keeping people he cared about safe and involved as well. But Meiling's feelings regarding marriage were something that Syaoran was not necessarily taken with. Despite all the time that he and Meiling had spent training together in martial arts growing up, he evidently did not feel the same way about her that she did for him. He still cared for her despite Meiling's constant behavior, just not in the way she hoped he would reciprocate. Both in terms of battle power and romance, there was a fundamental disharmony that characterized their relationship. A similar fundamental disharmony existed between Sakura and Syaoran. However, the manner that characterizes theirs differs significantly from his with Meiling's. Meiling's attachment to Syaoran was born from young infatuation that bordered on potentially obsessive and possessive. Sakura's attachment to Syaoran was rooted first and foremost in the desire to be friends pursuing the same goal. In that sense, Sakura's approach to dealing with him involved a gentler hand, one that did not so much force its presence into his life, so much as always have the hand extended in good faith. Perhaps most significant of all the differences was how each of them factored into Syaoran's life as a magician overall. Meiling's presence was someone who, when viewed through perhaps the most cynical possible lens, would help serve as a means to an end for Syaoran. Even if she were to somehow gain a Clow card herself, Meiling's devotion to Syaoran was such that she would likely hand it over to him without a second thought. Sakura, on the other hand, would never voluntarily relinquish any of the Clow to Syaoran if she could help it. One girl would do it to please Syaoran as a sign of her love for him. The other feels a sense of responsibility for unleashing the Clow upon Tomoeda in the first place and commit to her original calling. For someone who was raised to honor his quasi-divine right to obtain what should be his, Syaoran could perhaps, on some minor level, acknowledge the steadfastness Sakura displayed in her conviction. The one element that united them both was that Sakura and Meiling were privy to being at the brunt end of Syaoran's coldness, but even then, there was a difference. Sakura's inexperience and misunderstanding of how to properly use the Clow earned Syaoran's ire, while Meiling's unfortunate habit of recklessly getting involved in battles tended to cause more trouble than solve it. But over time, his harder edge softened. Syaoran managed to obtain a few of the Clow cards himself, yet Sakura gradually began to master her own cards and grew more both in ability and confidence. Syaoran had to accept, even if begrudgingly, that not only was Sakura coming into her own as a magician, but also that she was indeed worthy of wielding the Clow. Coupled with showing an increased concern for Sakura's well-being as time progressed, and getting flustered or blushing more often, Syaoran's feelings for Sakura began to grow. Two moments of Syaoran's feelings stand out in this respect. Though Syaoran would ultimately claim 9 total cards throughout the first arc of the series, when presented with the Cloud card, he chose to give it to Sakura rather than keep it. While Syaoran said that whoever kept the card didn't matter since they'd all be his eventually, he looked back with wondered concern at Sakura's bedroom window after escorting her back, ignoring Keroberos and Meiling's bickering. Sakura, in turn, repays his kindness with the Sand card. Initially, the card landed between the two of them since both played such a vital role in its capture. Syaoran moved his hand away and was intending to let Sakura keep it, but she reasoned that Syaoran was the one who thought of how to seal it away, and should therefore be his. Syaoran could posture all he wanted about how they were rivals, but the roots of their relationship that had been planted were germinating. When faced with Yue's trial, Syaoran was outclassed and easily lost. But when Sakura triumphed, he smiled. He accepted the fact that he was bested, a far cry from the reaction he might have had only a short time ago. With the trial complete, Syaoran had every intention of leaving Tomoeda to return to Hong Kong. However, the unusual arrival of Eriol from the United Kingdom concerned him. The way in which Eriol managed to woo or charm Sakura drove Syaoran crazy. At this point, his feelings for Sakura moved beyond simple friendship and into a schoolyard crush and further, to the point where he deliberately put off his departure. While Syaoran attempted numerous times to deny it, he nevertheless continued to be an anchor in Sakura's life, helping her convert the Cloud cards into Sakura cards. After a rather discomforting experience in an elevator shaft, the two eventually began to address each other on a given-name basis. This, coupled with conversations with Yue and Tomoyo, along with a surprise return visit from Meiling, helped Syaoran realize that Sakura was someone he had come to truly love. The symbol of their love was not a magic talisman or a card, nor was it merely voiced through a confession. Instead, it could best be understood as a stuffed bear. Depending on which version of the series you're experiencing, the timeline of how the bears are exchanged or made differs slightly, but the commonality among all of the versions is that it acts as a perfect visual sign of how Syaoran's perspective on himself, Sakura, and his life had changed. What was once someone so devoted to his skills with a sword and magic was instead giving something soft. Along with that bear came a heartfelt promise. Syaoran and Sakura would be reunited forever one day, and that their love was such that no border could separate it. Once a rival, now irreplaceable. Once someone he looked at with contempt, he looked at with sincerity. Once someone for whom he felt nothing but antagonism, he felt warmth and deep affection. Syaoran Li indeed believed he was destined for greatness, but he soon learned that greatness and power was insubstantial without greatness of heart. His bid for power came with a heart that was lonely and cold, if not outright antagonistic. He never got the power that he longed to possess, but in time, Syaoran learned to accept that being in the presence of those who care about and love him mattered more. They may not have made him into a better magician, so to speak, but they indeed made him into a better person. And nowhere was this more evident than with the person who reached out to him when he first came to Tomoeda. In Sakura's arms, he felt from her a magic that was more profoundly human than fantastical. It was her love for him and his love for her, joined together through hardships, revelations, and comforting kindness. For perhaps the first time since he learned of his bloodline and his magical powers, Syaoran was truly happy. It was a kind of magic that Clow Reed never could have given him.